Hello, and thanks for listening to Forward, a podcast about the compelling stories, important issues, and memorable art that move us. My name is Mari.
And my name is Christopher.
Thanks for joining us.
Today, we're looking at the artists behind the movies we love and exploring if it takes a good person to make a good movie, and if it's possible for an amoral person to make a quote-unquote good movie. But first, we'll get started with our Article Forward segment, where we each share 2 stories that got us thinking this week. Mari, what do you have for us?
So this is an NPR article that's an excerpt from a new book called You, Your Child in School, Navigate Your Way to the Best Education. It's a book by Sir Ken Robinson and Lou Aronica. Sir Ken Robinson is a boss and has some great TED Talks on education, which I highly recommend anyone check out. They're super interesting. They're all about prioritizing creativity in education, and I really love his worldview. He's also really, really funny, so you will get something out of it no matter what. This particular article highlights a school in Roxbury, Massachusetts, which was a very troubled school. Low test scores, lots of behavior problems, and a staff of security guards that cost $250,000 a year. In 2010, they hired a new principal who had the radical idea to fire the security guards and instead invest that money in arts programs. He worked to strengthen the school's culture and community, and the school saw a huge improvement. He says, "Kids do well when you design and build a school that they want to be in. Having great arts programs and athletics programs makes school an enjoyable place to be, and that's when you start to see success." It's inspiring to hear stories like this, not just because of the lower rates of behavior problems or the high test scores, but because kids should enjoy being at school. School shouldn't be a prison that children are trapped in. It should be a place that excites and inspires them. And that's how people actually learn and grow as humans. So I was really excited to read this article, always excited to hear anything from Sir Ken Robinson. It's definitely super inspirational for me as an educator and for anyone who's interested in education or if you're a parent or anything like that. So check out the article, check out the book. I definitely intend to read the whole book whenever I get a chance.
Very cool. My post is called How to Pick a Career That Actually Fits You. So this post is from one of my all-time favorite writers on the internet, Tim Urban, and it's on his blog, Wait But Why. Tim is known for writing these long, dense posts that unpack large, complex topics. So think of things like the rise of AI, how to find the right partner to marry, and just how to be happy. This time he's focusing on how people can find a job that actually fits them, which is something that has a huge impact on your life and just your overall happiness. I love this post because it's far more complex than any I've ever read with any kinds of job advice or about how to pick your career. It literally starts at the beginning. Before you can figure out what you want to achieve, you need to have a better understanding of who you are. And most of this post is actually just a large framework to figuring out your true desires. It's basically how do you go about finding yourself. After this process of self-examination, he goes through this process of how do you start to prioritize all your different desires. And then you kind of go through this minor reality check about what's possible for you to actually achieve based on those desires. Really then and only then can you begin thinking about all your different career options. And again, I like this post because too often people start at the end of the process when they start to think about their jobs. If you actually follow the advice in this post, you'd be on your way to a true journey of self-discovery. I myself have certainly made bad career decisions in the past because I was chasing desires that weren't really my own, so I cannot recommend this post enough.
Really cool. Definitely something that everyone can relate to, I'm sure.
Next up is our forward-thinking segment. In this segment, we take a closer look at one topic that's been on our minds this week. In this episode, we're exploring what impact the morality of filmmakers has on their movies, and to what degree a film's morality plays into whether a movie is good or not. These days, when there's a new hot movie, critics and audiences alike are grading it on more than just the believability of its characters and the originality of its story. Oftentimes, it's the movie's morality, or lack thereof, that dominates the online conversation around it. Does this movie have a positive or negative message? Is it inclusive of marginalized members of society, or does it further alienate? Is it socially aware, or is it harmful? And even, is the person who made it someone we would consider to be a good person? This conversation has naturally brought the morality of the filmmakers behind all of these movies into question. So how much does an artist's morality influence their art? Mari, how about you get us started? Do you think it's possible for a bad person to make quote unquote good art, at least in terms of quality?
It's such a lot to unpack with this question, right? Because obviously, your sort of initial question is what even makes a good movie in the first place. But let's put that aside for just a second, because yeah, like you said, nowadays, especially with like social media the way it is, and kind of this like 24-hour news cycle the way it is, we actually know a lot more about the people who make movies than we ever did before. We know like all about their personal lives, and they're being held accountable a lot more for the bad things they do. Obviously all of the Me Too stuff, all of the sexual harassment, sexual assault, even racism, and like other things that maybe aren't illegal but are definitely bad things to do. It comes up, people notice, and people are not letting it stand anymore. And I think what comes up a lot is when it comes out that a filmmaker has done something or is accused of doing something. It's like, well, you can't see his movies. Like, don't go see his movies anymore. Don't ever watch any of his old movies. And I understand that argument from like a financial perspective. Like, you don't want to financially support somebody who's done bad things. I get that. But I think it is an interesting question of like, well, are those movies still good? If Woody Allen is a child molester, is Annie Hall still a good movie? And I think it's probably like, something kind of like case by case, but you do kind of wonder like if somebody who has like such little regard for other human beings is capable of making art that's really meaningful and can touch people.
Yeah, and I think that maybe kind of goes well into my first point, because like you said, this is a really large topic to unpack. So before I can think about if a bad person can make a good movie, I need to figure out what a good movie is. And I started really simple, not thinking about the morals at all. Simple stuff. Like I said, a good movie has smooth editing, smooth camera work, things that you're not even going to notice. It's going to have music that complements and works really well with the story and, heightens the mood. And it's going to have characters that we can believe, a story that grips us, starts to surprise, it's novel. If all this stuff sounds boring, I think that's kind of the point, because I think when you think about what makes a good movie, it's a lot of that stuff that you really don't think about. And then I think that kind of opens the door really well in terms of then, okay, so how do you make a movie like that? I think what you start to see is someone's morality doesn't factor in as much as you think. At least that's kind of what I was reaching.
Right. Well, like definitely on the technical aspects, right? Because you don't need to be a good person in order to, edit sound or know how to set up a shot or like do the lighting or anything like that. All the technical stuff I think is sort of obviously wouldn't seem to be impacted by, whether or not somebody's a good person. But one of the things you got into was like, the believability of the characters and like something that kind of moves you. And I think that's where it starts to get into like, well, if somebody is like fundamentally lacking in empathy or, lacking in being able to take other people's perspectives, is it even possible for them to, like, let's keep this in the realm of like directors who are also like writers to some extent.
Yeah.
Like auteurs. Would it be possible for somebody who's really lacking in empathy to create a compelling story that people can relate to and that can, touch people and make them feel something?
Yeah. And I would have to say no, at least just judging by my very loose definition of what makes a good movie. I think you have to have some kind of empathy, at least if you're going to create characters that aren't just like clones of yourself with different names. I think you have to have like some kind of self-awareness, just a knowledge of how's my art going to come across to someone else besides me. I mean, at least like how else do you like make it relatable? And I think just, again, nuts and bolts stuff, you're going to have like some kind of curiosity, some kind of open-mindedness to create something new, or at least something that's going to resonate with people. And when you start to add up all of that, you can kind of start to see, okay, well, I can understand then how someone could create characters that are real, are people that you would see on the street, are going to act in a more reasonable way, and that they're going to be diverse and not just versions of that person. But I think what you also see is none of those traits have any kind of morality in them.
Mm.
At least not to me.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think that like you were talking about open-mindedness, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's something that I would consider to have a sort of moral quality. Not that like open-mindedness, I don't know. The way I said that sounded weird, but I think that having an open mind lends itself to being a good person, right? Because if you have an open mind, then you're open to other people's ideas and other people's experiences, and you're not only thinking about yourself and the way you experience things, and it allows you to have greater empathy, and to care about other people more. So I think that open-mindedness is definitely something that's crucial to being a good artist, the way we're talking about, and it's also something that I think is pretty necessary to being a good person who has strong relationships with people.
Well, see, I would totally agree with all that. And when I was thinking about it before this is the best way to put it. I think it is accurate to say you can't be a good person without those traits. But having those traits does not make you a good person. And I think, something like empathy, all that is really saying is that I can start to understand how other people feel and I can share in their feelings. That doesn't mean that I have sympathy or that I have, any kind of respect for that person. And so I think when you start looking at it that way, it, predisposes you to being good. Because then you're kind of a crazy person where like if you see someone suffering, it's like, well, I understand why they're suffering, but I'm going to take no action. It's like, well, that's kind of weird.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But like obviously there are people like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're talking about a small group of people here just
Mm-hmm.
by the fact that like this conversation is something we're having. If it was a common thing, we would already know the answer to it.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think also there are different ways of being a good person and being a bad person, right?
For sure.
Like Bill Cosby just was convicted in his second trial, which is great. And obviously he's a total monster and has been a monster apparently this whole time, and we never knew. And that's a little bit different because I don't think he was like writing any of the things that he was on or anything, and I never saw any of his stand up or anything like that. So I can't really speak to anything that he like created. And and then on the other hand, you have filmmakers who just kind of don't care about, like, they just don't really care that much about women, or they just don't really care that much about like people of color, and sometimes you see that reflected in their films as well. And obviously that's kind of a different way of being an asshole. And so I think like depending on the specific qualities of the person, like depending on where they're lacking, it might be more likely to come out in the things that they do, or less likely.
Oh, for sure. And I'm actually glad you brought up Bill Cosby, because after thinking about all these traits of what makes a good movie and what do you need to make a good movie, I kind of got to this point where like, okay, some people are going to fall in this bucket. And I would say someone like Bill Cosby does. And you're totally right. He wasn't, he probably wasn't writing most of the stuff. I'd have to go Google this to be sure. But he clearly was bringing a character to life that resonated.
Yeah.
And I would go as far as to say I'm sure Bill Cosby played a hand in episodes of that show that had a positive moral message.
For sure.
So clearly he's an amoral person, and not only can he make a good show or a good TV episode, he can make one with a moral message, and that starts to get really weird.
Yeah, because like the Cosby Show is seen, like both of his shows are seen as these like really wholesome,
For
like,
sure.
Positive representations of like African American families, and they have like, obviously because it was a family show in the 80s, like they had to have really moral messages. And yet to think that like one of the main people behind both of those shows was this total monster.
And same for something just like Harvey Weinstein.
Oh yeah.
I feel like the Weinstein Company has made so many movies that I've enjoyed, both that were just fun movies that I liked, but also ones clearly with a strong, positive, moral message.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and one of the things that we kept kind of finding out from all the stuff coming out was that he was really highly involved in a lot of those movies, and like even influencing in some cases the direction that the movie went and like what happened in the movie. And so yeah, it's again like a total monster, but like had a huge part in making movies that like really resonated with people.
Yeah, and so I think like those two are clearly people that are not like more cut and dry to say they're bad, because even that is a strange way to put it. But I think they've clearly had enough issues that demonstrate they have, like quite a large amount of problems. But I'm sure there's even, and again, this is just like lots of Googling around. Like I was looking at most controversial directors and things like that, just to try to like stimulate my thoughts. And what was interesting is a lot of the kind of more controversial directors, all the movies they brought up that caused controversy, I've never heard of them.
Interesting.
I kind of came with the conclusion that sure, it is possible for kind of someone to sneak through who's a bad person and make a good movie, even a good movie with a moral message. But for the most part, they're making these just kind of rotten movies that no one really gives a crap about. But you have critics raving like, oh, this movie's really tough to watch, but it has all this symbolism, like blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, like great, whatever. Yeah, no, I was looking at Roman Polanski for this conversation, kind of for that reason. And he's like this legend, Chinatown and Rosemary's Baby and stuff. And like I haven't seen Rosemary's Baby. I've seen Chinatown. He also did The Pianist, which I also haven't seen, but obviously Adrian Brody got an Oscar for that. From what I remember of Chinatown, obviously it's regarded as this like classic kind of neo-noir. That movie is super nihilist. It's just this movie of like, everyone is horrible and nothing matters and everyone's gonna cheat and abuse each other. And it's like, obviously it's not, it's not like a nice movie. And you can debate about whether it's a good movie or not, but yeah, it's not like the Cosby Show where it's like something you watch to feel good. And so you can kind of be like, oh, like maybe this is how he sees the world, because he's kind of a rotten person,
Well, yeah. And you kind of mentioned this earlier where some people are obviously on the whole good, but they have one demon or, a few problems. And sometimes it just doesn't come out because their work isn't touching on that. A lot of my Googling around brought up Lars von Trier. Who clearly has his share of problems, but I think we both like his second to last movie, Melancholia.
I know, I can't help it. I love it.
But see, that's a great example of a movie that's dealing all about, like depression. And clearly he suffers from depression. And so that movie was very personable. It came across in a much more human way. Yeah. But obviously his other movies, Antichrist,
Nymphomaniac.
Yeah, and Nymphomaniac. Both those clearly have horrible depictions of women. And I think you can even take this to the extreme, movies just like Birth of a Nation, but even a movie that I found out that I didn't know about, which is called Triumph of the Will.
Yeah, big Nazi movie.
Yeah, it's a big Nazi movie. Clearly, just like Birth of a Nation, a lot of real like technical skill went into that, but it's clearly a horrible movie. Right.
Well, in that's like kind of a whole other discussion. It's like Birth of a Nation. I think it's mostly remembered as a great film, mostly because of its innovation. And
for sure,
maybe that's different from like technical skill. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to really tell you the answer to that. But like, yeah, it's like it was innovative and it was kind of like the birth of the epic, And so it's like it's noteworthy for that reason. But even without the whole KKK thing, which is obviously what the whole movie is about, but is a movie good just because it was the first to do something? You know what I mean? It's like it's innovative and it's novel. But even does that make a good movie? So that's like kind of a whole other conversation. Yeah. But obviously throughout history, when people were not as cognizant and like just really just didn't care and like even had agendas that they were trying to push to oppress people, you could have a movie that was like had all the technical capabilities and was actively used to oppress people. Speaking of Birth of a Nation, obviously there's The Birth of a Nation by Nate Parker, and that had its own controversy, which is a very different controversy than the original Birth of a Nation, where The Birth of a Nation is supposed to be this story of this like slave uprising. Is supposed to be very like positive for like it's like a more positive portrayal for Black people, and it's supposed to be this really cool like interesting new movie. And then it turned out that Nate Parker was accused of raping somebody. It's like, oh well, it really just tarnished the movie for something that's arguably unrelated, but also you can't just say like, oh, it doesn't matter. And like I think that is kind of like almost at the heart of what we're talking about is like if a rapist makes a movie that could be like really culturally relevant and even culturally positive, um, is the value of the movie diminished?
I don't have a necessarily good answer in the sense I thought about it from the opposite perspective.
Oh, what was your perspective?
Can a movie be good if it has, you know, like an amoral message, or if it has like one or two like, you know, highly problematic scenes? Can it still be good?
Right.
And rather than can a movie that separated from the director, which is good, still be good if the director himself is, you know, either convicted of rape or something else?
Right.
I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. I think like I haven't seen the new Birth of a Nation, partly because it was like, you know, I feel like it was still in festivals when this whole thing came out about him, and so I just never ended up seeing it. Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I think it's everything is so case by case because like let's take Annie Hall, which is a movie that I have seen many times, and it's, you know, it's many people's, like if you like Woody Allen movies, it's probably it's many people's favorite Woody Allen movie, and I do like it a lot. And there are a lot of scenes in the movie that I find really relatable to me, and I think that it makes you kind of think about relationships and, you know, kind of your agency and like what you want in a relationship and stuff like that. And Woody Allen's character in that movie is definitely, in my opinion, not supposed to be super sympathetic. I think he's definitely an asshole, and you're supposed to think that he's an asshole, and he doesn't get what he wants in the end, because Annie leaves him because he's a dick. And so I think that largely it's like not an amoral movie. I think a lot of it is super relatable and really funny and even kind of touching. I think Diane Keaton is a national treasure. She's wonderful and she's so good in that movie. But there are scenes in the movie where they like make casual references to like grown men, you know, having sexual relationships with teenage girls, and it really does take you out of the movie. You know, for me, in this day and age, you know, you're like watching this movie about this adult relationship, and then like his friend Max will come in and be like, "Oh, I was about to have a three-way with 16-year-old twins," and you're just like, "What? Where did that come from?" You know, because that's not. I mean, I don't know. Maybe people talked like that in the 70s. I don't really know. But that's not a normal conversation for like two grown men who are like in their 30s or 40s today to be having, right? If you Christopher, as a 29-year-old, had a friend who was like in his 30s and said, "Oh, I was about to have a three-way with two 16-year-olds," you would probably say like, "Dude, I think you need to be arrested."
Yeah.
Right? Like that's really not okay.
Yeah, and this might be a strange opinion to have, but like no movie is really that good that I'd want to bend over backwards to defend the director just so I can keep enjoying the movie, right? Like it's not like someone who, you know, like invented this life-saving invention where I'm conflicted but I need this invention to survive.
Right.
It's like this is just another stupid movie and there's 50 other movies right behind it, and there's 1,000 other people right behind this guy or girl who wants to take their place in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Having a movie gives you a huge platform, which is dangerous. And should we be giving people who could potentially be sharing negative messages a big platform to influence people?
For sure. I think you kind of like got at the heart of it. And like I think the only thing I was trying to say about Annie Hall was like when that stuff creeps in to the movie, like any movie, I think it does diminish the quality because it just takes you out of it so much. You know, it reminds you that the filmmaker has something going on that's really not cool, and you're just like, oh fuck, like it kind of ruins it. Well, you know, but like I agree with your point that we don't need to go crazy preserving these movies that were made by monsters, because there are all these other movies that are made by not monsters, and you know, it's not like a huge fucking tragedy to never see this movie again.
Well, yeah, and I think as I was researching this and looking into kind of more controversial movies, obviously beyond something like Annie Hall, where there's just like a couple jokes that seem off color, movies that have, like extended scenes of rape or violence and torture. I was reading all this stuff. I'm like, you've got to be effing kidding me.
Yeah.
Because I read about these movies and then critics, like I said, bending over backwards are like, yeah, we know this movie's tough to watch, but it's got a great message. I'm like, dude, if that's the only way you know how to convey a message, you got bigger problems.
Yeah.
And we should never glorify any of these movies that use gratuitous violence as a means to an end. I think it's nonsense.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's a good point. Yeah, it's that, like, no movie is so valuable that, like, not seeing it or, like, kind of saying, like, oh, maybe we should, not give it an Oscar or not include it in the Criterion Collection, you know what I mean, would be, like, such a crime against humanity. You know what I mean? No movie is that valuable. And, I'm not saying, like, burn all the DVDs. Like,
yeah,
it's
of
still,
course.
It's up to the publishers if they want to keep publishing it. Like, whatever, that's fine. If people want to buy it, they can buy it. But I think basically just like what you were saying, there's no need to bend over backwards defending the works of somebody who is a psychopath.
Yeah, and like they don't even need to be truly deranged, but I think it helps to acknowledge, like, yeah, there's some problematic parts of this movie. And that doesn't mean we need to, like you said, go burn it. But it's just like keep watching it. But just like it helps to know that,
Right.
As opposed to watch it and think, oh, this movie's 100% on point.
Right.
I can think everything in here is totally okay.
Like I was saying about the those jokes in Annie Hall, like if you're aware of this stuff and then you see it in this movie that you otherwise like, it does start to ruin it, and that can be a sad thing for you, to for your favorite movie to be ruined. But it also kind of makes it like, well, I guess I don't really need this movie in my life that much, because you kind of realize it doesn't make me feel the way it used to.
No, I mean, it's really no different than when you go back and watch shows from your childhood. It's like, I love the Power Rangers. And then when I went back and rewatched the Power Rangers when I was 21, it was awful.
Yeah, it's like, oh, it's not as good as I remember.
It's not as good as I remember. I thought the special effects were so good. They're not. They look ridiculous.
For sure. Well, and even more relevantly, like if you watch Cheers or even Friends, which is more recent, there's so many episodes of and either of those shows, like like any sitcom that was like in the 80s or 90s, even How I Met Your Mother, we talked about this in another episode, where there's so many things that are problematic, and like when when you were younger or like at the time you didn't really think about it, but then going back and watching it again, it really makes you cringe. Again, it can be sad to kind of lose this thing that you really liked and that was really meaningful to you, but you get a new thing, like that's just life, like you lose things and you get new things.
Well, yeah, and mostly every piece of content that's created is meant to be consumed in the moment or that year. And some of this stuff, it's nice that you go back and like, wow, this is a real good time capsule of the 80s. And the 80s are great, but they also suck in some other ways, just like every decade.
Right.
But yeah, I don't need to like find myself in a movie from the 60s and adopt my identity based off that. Like there's better places to look.
Totally. And this kind of goes into a conversation of like what makes a good movie. I think so much of it is so contextual with like the time that it came out and the place that it came out and the culture kind of like surrounding it at the time. There are movies, we've talked about this many times, there are movies that came out in the 70s or 80s that were lauded as these great films, like they're classics, everybody loves them, and then when you and I watch them, it's just kind of like, I just don't really get it because it's not for me. It wasn't written for the person that I am. You know what I mean? It was written for somebody who was my age 40 years ago. Because really what it is like, does it resonate with you? And that's completely contextual, is completely cultural.
No, I mean, I think that is a huge piece of it.
And tying it back to our original conversation, now the personal lives of the filmmakers have become part of the context. And so in that way, it does start to influence like how you see the movie and how you see its quality. And it's different for different people. But I think like our original question of like, can a bad person make a good movie would seem to be yes. Seems like, because even just like people can just compartmentalize, you know,
Oh,
like
for sure.
they can just have like this other part of their life that they just like lock off, and then when they're making a movie they just access this other part of their brain, you know. So
Yeah.
I think then I guess the bigger question is like, well, what do you do with that, you know? If there's a really good movie that really resonated with you, and then you find out that the director, the writer, is this like horrible person who's done horrible things, I guess like only you can decide how that impacts your feelings about the movie.
No, totally. And as long as you consider it and consider your impact on it, you can make your decision.
Mm-hmm. There's one other like point that I'd like to bring up that I think is interesting as kind of like a tangential point to this. A few years ago, for whatever reason, it was very common for movies to have like either like whitewash a character, or they would like have a white person playing a person of color. Like for some reason it was happening a lot over a period of a few years. And I got curious about like whether those movies actually ended up being good or like highly rated or successful. And what I found was that most of the movies who did that kind of thing, like whitewashing, or like had a white actor playing an actor, a character of color, most of them had like pretty low ratings on Rotten Tomatoes. They didn't make that much money in the box office. And I just thought that was interesting, because in that specific instance, it did seem that like having like poor morals reflected poorly on the film itself.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think even though the answer to our initial question is yes, I think it's yes, but it's rare.
For sure.
And
Because you do still need to have a certain amount of, like we were saying, like open-mindedness and empathy and compassion in order to connect with people, you know? And if you're like closed-minded to the extent that you don't understand why having a white actor play a person of color would be a problematic thing, then you're probably not open-minded enough, and honestly probably not smart enough to make a good movie that's going to be highly rated and is going to really connect with people.
agreed. Our final segment of the podcast is Watch List. In this segment, we recommend one TV show or movie that's flying beneath the radar but worth checking out. Our watch list recommendation is Marvel's Runaways. Runaways is a Hulu original series that's based on the critically acclaimed comic book series of the same name written by Brian K. Vaughan, who's probably most famous for his current series, Saga. The story follows a group of 6 teenagers who discover one night that their wealthy California parents are actually supervillains. This unlikely group of kids then unites to unmask their parents for who they really are. The story is more complex than this straightforward premise, and there's a good deal of mystery and personal character drama as well. I can totally understand if you're burnt out on Marvel shows or any other kind of superhero shows. I think you might be relieved to know that the superhero elements of this series are pretty small. There's no fighting that destroys the city or any kind of godlike villains here. And lastly, if you're a fan of the OC back when it was on, the series creator Josh Schwartz is actually behind this show as well.
It's definitely a really fun show. Highly recommend it. One thing to note, the first 2 episodes are a little slow, but when you get through them, the rest is really worth it. Well, that's it for us. If you enjoyed this podcast, just search for FWD, that's forward, in iTunes or your favorite podcast app to subscribe, or you can subscribe on SoundCloud.
Thank you so much for listening. If you ever have any questions, thoughts, or topic suggestions, you can shoot us an email at forwardpodcast@gmail.com. That's fwdpodcast@gmail.com. Goodbye for now.
Bye.